Born a Colored Girl by Michael Edwin Q.
Life is made up of desperate hours. In between, we find moments of joy. A mother and daughter separated so long ago are about to be reunited. They will reach out to each other across miles, time, and even across the grave. From her mother's diary, Etta Jean will learn to love the mother she never knew. And from the same diary, a mother will finally give of herself.
Chapter 1. After All These Years. The bond between mother and daughter is strong, close, and for life. It is nearer than sisters, sweeter than honey, and eternal. To Etta Jean, such statements felt neither true nor false, fact nor fiction, having been separated from her mother at an early age. All she remembers was that she was born to a young slave girl, which made her a slave as well, at least for the early years of her life. She knew she once had a father named Richard, whom she held even fewer memories of, and that she was one of 4 children whose names she no longer remembered. She had been separated from her family at the age of 4. Through a series of events that some folks would call a streak of good luck, and others nothing short of a miracle, Etta Jean did not remain a slave for long. Though free for most of her life, she understood the limitations that society placed on her, with her ambitions always exceeding her grasp. Every city she lived in had a designated area for her kind. Only certain people and opportunities were available to her. She was raised in foster homes provided by church people who could afford to take her in for only so long. She bounced from home to home. By her mid-teens, she had blossomed into a tall and slender beauty. Many of the young men of the congregation had an eye for her, but she held on to other dreams. At 17, with her few belongings in a suitcase, she left her small southern town and headed north to Boston to seek a better life. In Boston, in the black part of town, with what little money she had, she rented a small room in a boarding house run by the widow Fay Wilkins. It was a large 3-story Victorian home broken up into single rooms, which the widow Wilkins mostly rented out to men working in the factories in the city. Most of her guests were married men who sent money home every week back to their families in small southern towns, each of them planning and hoping to someday save enough money to get a small place in town and send for their families. The widow Wilkins was a short, stout, middle-aged lady of fine manners and sharp business sense. She carried herself with great dignity. She always dressed in elegant clothing, and her manner was one of self-pride. Her hair was just turning gray on the sides. She was an admirable figure of a woman, and though she had seen better days, she could still turn a head or two. Most of the time, she went about with a fun-loving attitude, but she could turn it off as quick as an oil lamp when need be. In business, she was a no-nonsense woman. Little did Etta Jean realize that the widow Wilkins and the boarding house would play a major role in her life. Etta Jean was the only female guest of the boarding house. Being young and innocent, Mrs. Wilkins took her under her wing. The widow, having a motherly nature, and Etta Jean, growing up motherless and never knowing much about her true mother, the two hit it off well from the start. The job consisted of many different tasks to make for a busy day, up early in the morning, to kitchen work, cleaning rooms, and then laundry. Each day, she would have a few hours alone in her room. Usually, she'd read a book or her Bible. They served no lunch at the boarding house except on Sundays. The rest of the day, she spent cleaning, dusting, and doing laundry. At midday, she returned to the kitchen to prepare the evening supper, which they served promptly at 5:30. The rest of her evening was her own, again mostly spent in her room, reading or socializing with Mrs. Wilkins in the parlor with some of the guests. Under the widow Wilkins' guidance, Etta Jean's job became more than a way to make a living. It was an education. She learned how to do chores in quantity, but best of all, she learned to have a good head for business and to manage her money wisely. She worked 7 days a week, with every other Sunday off. The Sundays she did work, they started late so the staff could go to church. Mrs. Wilkins saw to it that Etta Jean attended and became an active member of a good local church. It was at this church that again Etta Jean's life took another turn for the better. After a few months, Etta Jean enjoyed the repetition and security of her life. And one Sunday afternoon, at a church picnic, she met Thomas Newman. Thomas was a tall, slender, handsome young black man. His arms were strong and wide from work. His chin came to a sharp point and gave nobleness to his looks. There were many women in the congregation who secretly yearned to know him. Though the pastor's wife often went out of her way to introduce him to some of the eligible women in the congregation, his head was never turned. Thomas possessed a strong spiritual life and was deeply involved in the church. He led a men's Bible study on Wednesday nights and was seldom seen without the good book far from his side. Though he was well educated, his education did him little good. He was a laborer at one of the factories like all the other young men in the parish, but his high intelligence did help him shine, and he was promoted to floor manager, overseeing quality control, only over the black workers, of course. Thomas lived in a different boarding house 3 blocks from Mrs. Wilkins. He wasn't a drinker or a gambler. He was a bit of a loner and kept pretty much to himself. But this all changed when he was introduced to Etta Jean, and only a few weeks later they were courting. It went on for nearly a year. Their relationship grew deep and strong. Neither of them could ever remember if Thomas ever really did propose to her. It just seemed like a natural thing to do. It was a June church wedding. Mrs. Wilkins was the matron of honor. They held the reception in the church hall, filled with the smiling faces of co-workers and friends. It was a potluck dinner with plenty for all. The adults stood talking and laughing for hours as children ran through the crowd chasing one another. The loving couple slipped away silently when no one was looking, and the hour was late. Etta Jean suspected they would go to Thomas's room, but to her surprise and delight, he took her 2 blocks north. They stood before a 2-story brownstone. Etta Jean looked at him in bewilderment. "This is your new home," he said proudly. "It's all ours. That is, after 30 years of payments, it will be." He'd put down nearly all of his savings. Etta Jean wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. When Thomas carried her over the threshold, it was the first time in her life she felt she was finally home. Etta Jean continued working for Mrs. Wilkins, and Thomas worked long and hard hours at the factory. They made a good life for themselves, and it was clear to everyone how much in love and happy they were. But sometimes when you think things couldn't get better, they do. What they shared was nothing compared to the joy they felt when they learned Etta Jean was with child. Early the next year, the child was born, and she was beautiful. Over much discussion, they decided to name her Liberty. The next few years were full and fruitful, but sometimes life takes an about face and things go bad, sometimes heartbreakingly bad. They didn't even have the decency to tell Etta Jean face to face. They sent a small boy, little George, who swept the floors and cleaned out the bins. When Etta Jean opened the front door, the poor child stood there quivering with fear. "Mrs. Newman, this here's for you," he said, handing her an envelope and running away in fear as if the devil was after him. Before she could say anything, little George was gone. Fearing the worst, Etta Jean sat down in the parlor. Baby Liberty slept quietly in her bassinet. Etta Jean opened the letter. It bore the letterhead of the company Thomas worked for.
Dear Mrs. Newman, it is with a heavy heart we regret to inform you that your husband, Thomas, met with a fatal accident on the job this morning. There is no reason to go into graphic detail, but we can tell you his passing was quick and painless. The factory doctor proclaimed him dead the moment he examined him. We've taken the liberty of transferring the body to Calverton's funeral parlor. Have no concern. We feel it is our duty to pay all expenses, as well as a burial plot and tombstone at Westland Cemetery. It is the least we can do. If you have any questions or are in need of anything, feel free to contact us. When you feel up to it, please come to our office. There are papers to be signed concerning back pay and insurance. Again, feel free to reach out if you need anything. Our condolences in your time of grief. Walter Sternward.
Not only did they not have the decency to confront her, they had the gall to make all the arrangements without her. Paying for it would take the financial burden off her, but not even consulting her was a slap in the face. She would have been angry if not for the flood of sorrow that swept over her. As if in solidarity, baby Liberty burst into a fit of crying. Etta Jean took her up in her arms. She stood by the window, gently bouncing her baby in her arms. It's okay, Liberty. Mama's here. Everything's going to be all right. Inwardly, she knew she was lying to her daughter and herself. There was no way she could admittedly say that everything was going to be all right. Once the child stopped crying and fell asleep, she placed Liberty back in her crib. The tears fell from Etta Jean's eyes. She looked out the window. The world was a blur and as unclear as their future. The funeral was a solemn affair. Calverton's funeral home was elegant, with red velvet drapes, dark wooden walls, and an organist playing soft and low. Surely Etta Jean could not have afforded Calverton if it weren't for the company's money. It was a closed casket. This told her that the death of her husband had been a horrible one that had disfigured his body. It was during the funeral that Etta Jean found out the truth. Some of Thomas's closer co-workers told her the full story. A large and heavy piece of machinery rested on a wooden plank. The old and dry wood cracked, causing the piece of machinery to fall upon Thomas. He was crushed and died instantly. The only saving grace she had was in knowing he didn't suffer. Again, Westland Cemetery was far out of Etta Jean's financial grasp, if not for the company's money. It was an integrated cemetery to an extent. Whites were buried in the area on the front of the property. Black graves were in the back 40, separated by a tall metal fence. At the cemetery, Mrs. Wilkins held little liberty to allow Etta Jean time to grieve. Looking around, she saw many of Thomas's co-workers and folks from the church. Each of them gave their heartfelt sympathy, but she was so deep within herself that she heard none of it. There was only one representative from the company, a short, round, little, bald, pasty-faced white man dressed in a dark suit that looked like he'd slept in it for days. One thin, long clump of hair was combed over the top of his globe-like head in a sad compensation for his baldness. It was clear by the expression on his face he did not want to be there. He moved like a man stepping around snakes. He approached Etta Jean and offered her his hand, which was as cold and numb as a dead fish. As soon as he gave the company's condolences, feeling he'd done his duty, he disappeared. The pastor prayed over the grave. Again, the words fell on her empty ears. Only the sound of her tossing a rose down into the grave upon her husband's coffin did she hear. To her, the sound was as loud as cannon fire, and it startled her back into reality. And in reality, all she could do was cry. Back home, guests filled the house. Members of the church covered the kitchen table with food and drink. Understandably, Etta Jean did not feel like eating. Thankfully, Liberty fell asleep and Etta Jean placed her in her crib. Hours later, people gave their condolences and began leaving. Etta Jean was thankful for them, yet she was glad they were leaving. Only Mrs. Wilkins remained. Is there anything you need before I leave? She asked Etta Jean. Etta Jean shook her head. Mrs. Wilkins put her arms around her and hugged her. If there's anything you need, you just ask. Don't worry about coming back to work. You take as much time as you need. I love you, child. These words Etta Jean heard because they were heartfelt. She cried in Fay Wilkins' arms. In time, the two broke loose of each other and sorrowfully smiled into each other's eyes. After Mrs. Wilkins left and the door closed, Etta Jean sat in the parlor alone. A strange feeling came over her. Being an orphan from an early age and moving from foster home to foster home until she set out on her own, Etta Jean believed she knew what being alone felt like. But this was something different. This was like being surrounded by walls of ice with the outside world miles away with no one to hear her scream, even if she did. This was the deepest and darkest place she ever imagined she'd be. If not for the love of her daughter, she might have given up and died. A week after the funeral, Etta Jean placed Liberty into the care of Mrs. Wilkins for the day and went down to the office of the factory. Again, she was not met by anyone in upper management, but she was taken to the office of Thomas's managers. She was met with a handful of papers to sign. She was faced with another lower manager who wanted to get the meeting over with as soon as possible. "What am I signing?" Etta Jean asked. "It's just a formality," said the manager. "It's all of your husband's back pay, and there is an insurance settlement." It would seem that the company had a little scam going. The factory was a dangerous place to work, so they insured all their workers. In case of death or dismemberment, the insurance company would pay up, 60% going to the company and 40% to the family of the injured party. Of course, it was a scam. But what was one to do? It was better to agree to 40% than nothing. And 40% was better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And besides, it would help with the mortgage payments. Perhaps Liberty and she could remain in their home. Etta Jean agreed to the terms. What else could she do? She was at their mercy, and there was no way to fight or disagree. A larger power than she made the rules. Etta Jean and her daughter sailed in a small ship on a large ocean, and the powers that be were ready to make large waves. She agreed to the terms and signed the papers. Etta Jean returned to work at Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house. Her wages would keep them in food and clothing. The insurance money would pay the mortgage and keep the wolf away from the door, but it would still be a struggle. The church had a program for children where Liberty spent her time while her mother worked. In time, she was old enough to attend public school. As progressive as Boston was, it was still a school for blacks only. The years seemed to pass by both slowly and quickly, as time had a habit of doing. When Liberty turned 9 years old, another unexpected turn happened. It was a lazy Saturday evening. Liberty was studying her books, and Etta Jean busied herself with sewing that she did for extra money. Besides working for Mrs. Wilkins, she took in laundry and sewing, mostly for the elderly. Etta Jean worked constantly, except for when she was sleeping, and she would have worked in her sleep if she knew how. The life of a single mother is one of hard work and sacrifice. There was a knock at the door. Liberty ran to see who it was. Standing in the doorway was a tall, handsome white man. "You must be Liberty," said the man, smiling. "Is your mother home?" Etta Jean walked up and stood behind her daughter. "May I help you?" she asked. "Are you Mrs. Newman?" he asked. It took a moment for Etta Jean to respond. Never in her life had she set eyes on such a well-dressed man, white or black, in her life. The Reverend Carter was the best-dressed man she had ever met before, but this man outshined him. He wore a dark suit, waistcoat, and a heavy black coat. Clearly, what he wore was custom made for him, as everything fit perfectly. His black shoes reflected the surroundings like mirrors. A gold watch chain dangled from his waistcoat, and he wore two fine rings on his left hand, a wedding ring and a sapphire pinky ring. His fingernails were professionally manicured, and every blonde hair on his head sat uniformly as if he placed each strand there carefully, one by one. Finally, Etta Jean spoke. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" He took from his inner pocket a business card and handed it to her. "My name is Jaggers. I'm a lawyer from Colorado. I have a unique legal practice. I have only one client." Etta Jean remained silent, waiting for Mr. Jaggers to finish. "That one client is Elizabeth Walker, your mother." If he'd hit her with a 2x4, it would have been a softer blow. Etta Jean was speechless. "I've come a long way, Mrs. Newman. May I please come in?" "Yes, of course," she said, moving out of the way. "Liberty, why don't you take your books up to your room, please?" she said as Mr. Jaggers entered. Liberty took her books and went upstairs while Etta Jean and Mr. Jaggers went into the parlor. She motioned for him to sit, which he did. She sat in a chair facing him, not saying a word. I realize this comes as a shock to you. First, let me say that your mother passed away a month ago. She died a very wealthy woman living in Colorado. Do you remember your mother, Mrs. Newman? Not really. Well, she never forgot you. You're mentioned in her will. Mr. Jaggers, I don't want to be impolite, but my mother gave me up years ago when I was a toddler. I've not heard a word from her in all those years. I'm sorry she died, but to be honest, I couldn't care less. The woman means nothing to me, as I'm sure I meant nothing to her. If the poor woman had regrets on her deathbed, it's nothing to do with me. Whatever she left in her will, I want none of it. You can just give it all to some charity. Now, at the risk of sounding rude, could you please leave? A smile appeared on Mr. Jagger's face. It was a gentle smile, but it seemed out of place on such a serious looking man. We figured as much, that is, your mother and I, he said. Won't you give her a chance to explain? And how would she go about doing that, since she's dead? Mr. Jaggers reached into his inner coat pocket and handed her an envelope. Here's a letter of introduction from your mother. There are no answers in that, but perhaps you may find some here, he said as he reached into the deep side pocket of his coat and handed her a leather-bound notebook. Etta Jean held both the envelope and the book. She opened the book. It wasn't in print, it was handwritten. The book is not in your mother's handwriting, but the letter is. When your mother learned she was dying, she wanted to get her story on paper. Each day, one of my secretaries visited her at her bedside and wrote down what she said. She died 3 days after its completion. She did it in hopes it might explain to you what happened and you would not judge her so harshly. Mr. Jaggers stood up. I'll be staying at the Parker house if you need me. This is not the end of it. There is more to come. More? What do you mean more? Etta Jean said, rising from her chair. Mr. Jaggers walked to the front door and opened it. Mrs. Newman, please just read the letter and book. Perhaps then you'll understand. You know where to find me. If I don't hear from you, I'll be in touch. He walked out, gently closing the door behind him. Etta Jean was speechless. She didn't know what to think or do, so she placed the letter and book down on the desk in the corner of the room. Then she walked to the bottom of the stairs and shouted up, Liberty! Dinner will be ready in a few minutes. I'll be right there, Mama, Liberty shouted down. Etta Jean went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. After dinner, when Liberty was asleep in her room and the house was dark, Etta Jean sat in the parlor holding her mother's letter. She stared at it for the longest time before opening it. She knew everything was about to change. And change, though necessary for life, is a frightening prospect. Finally, she carefully opened the envelope. She unfolded the letter and leaned closer to the lamp to get a better look. It was only one page. The first thing she noticed was the handwriting. It was thin and shaky, the handwriting of someone very old or very sick. Before reading a word, Etta Jean closed her eyes for a moment. She tried to remember what her mother looked like, but it was so long ago, and all she could picture in her mind was the silhouette of a woman hovering over her. She tried to remember anything her mother did for her, any interaction between the two of them. Not that it mattered, really. This was the writing of a dying woman. This was not the woman she remembered, no matter how little memory there was. She opened her eyes. Holding the paper in her shaking hand, she read the letter.
My dearest child, Etta Jean, I'm not sure I should be doing this, or what words I should say to you. Surely nothing I could offer can make it better. I'm sure you've been through much sorrow. For this, I am sorry. You are one of my 4 children. I doubt if you remember your brothers and sister. There was Willie and Henry, your brothers, and Emma May, your twin sister. That's right. I don't know if you remember, but you had a twin sister. Do not bother to look for any of them. They can no longer be found in this world. Sadly, they've all passed on. I tried for years to find them and you, but the war made it impossible. It wasn't until after that the war that I made any headway. It broke my heart to learn all but one of you was gone. But my only glimmer of hope was when I learned you were alive and well. I wanted to rush to you when I learned of you, but the doctors say it's not to be. If we had met, I know it would have been awkward, but we would have talked about our lives, the past that led us to where we are now. I ache to know your story, but sadly, I will never live to hear it. So I have put my life story down on paper. It's not a confession or a plea for forgiveness. I don't expect that. It is the only way I have of reaching out to you, reaching across so many years and miles, and now from across the grave. Please read it. Perhaps after reading it, you won't judge me so harshly. With all my heart, Mother.
Etta Jean was filled with mixed feelings. She sat in the dark holding the letter till her eyes became heavy and she fell asleep.